that said 67% of Americans haven't done any estate planning. That's consistent with other things we've seen too. There are many reasons why people don't do this kind of work, but we'll tell you at the top of a lot of those lists, it's because nobody wants to address their mortality. You want to talk about how wealth is really built? We primarily work with people that are first generation wealth, right? How do you keep that going? You pass it on generation to generation. This is a big part of how you do that. That is how you strengthen your family over time, is good planning, good positioning, good thought, good discussion on matters like this. You have to change the narrative around death.
Welcome to Critical Thinking Required, hosted by LBW. This podcast is intended for free thinkers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge seekers. Join us as we discuss relevant financial topics, explore with guests their financial journeys, and engage with experts in industries such as space, media and entertainment, real estate, and many more. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome to Critical Thinking Required. You're with your host, myself, Tim Bickmore, and my colleague, Dan Weiss. And today we are going to talk about death. We're going to talk about death today and what that means and what you should do to get prepared for the inevitable. I think Dan has a really good quote that he'll probably mention, so I'm not going to steal it from him. But it is something that does happen. It is the circle of life, but we also should be prepared for it and the financial or potential financial ramifications of leaving this earth. Before we start, I just want to let everybody know if you like our content and like what we do, please share, subscribe, and like what we do. It really does help us, promotes us, which is fantastic. So thank you. For today, we really want it to be very educational, like all of our podcasts, but I think we have a pretty good outline of what to do. So my first question is, where does somebody even start having this conversation? Like, where do you start? Tell us about that.
We'll keep it a little high level here. This is really about conceptual. In fact, what we probably ought to do is bring in some of the great estate planning attorneys that we know to get a bit more in depth on some of the bulk of some of this material, but let's keep it a bit more broad based. So in that spirit of things, starting, you really have to take an accounting of what you're even looking at, right? Both qualitatively and quantitatively. So what does that mean? It means, where are your assets? What do those assets actually look like? And creating a list of what you want to address. We really actually recommend, which we'll get to too, not necessarily creating that alone. Maybe you start that way because people do forget things very easy, sometimes very big things. But nonetheless, we digress on that. And then who does it impact? So who is going to be receiving what in what way? Who is going to not be receiving X, Y, and Z? How is that going to maybe alter their life or alter the way they feel about the gift that they're getting or not getting? And then really understanding who you maybe need to protect or protect from, playing out these different scenarios in your head. That's all a mental accounting. But you'll start, I think, with just partly the thought process behind it, as well as what we're actually looking to address from a tangible or financial component. That's the first thought, is just think about it. Now, funny thing about that is that might seem simple. It's not. There was a quote that we were looking at, which is consistent with a lot of other articles that we've read from CNBC from April of this year, 2022, that said 67% of Americans haven't done any estate planning. That's consistent with other things we've seen too. There are many reasons why people don't do this kind of work, but we'll tell you, at the top of a lot of those lists, it's because nobody wants to address their mortality. We get that. It's not a fun subject, but it's common. And so when you don't do that, who does that really hurt? And that's really kind of where the thinking about starts from. And I think also people don't know what to do. There's misconceptions about the cost involved. It's overwhelming about what you don't know, that you don't think about this all the time. So there's a lot of reasons and barriers to keep us from going down this direction. So we want to break that barrier a bit today. So thinking about it yourself, that's the first step.
It's a good first step. And I do think when we do a mental accounting or actually writing down what we have for assets and liabilities on the planning side, is sometimes you uncover a few nuggets. We do find that a lot. We're like, oh, I forgot I had that insurance policy. Oh, I forgot I had that old 401k with this other employer. So it is like cleaning out a closet. You forget that you had some really cool socks I haven't worn for a few years. You're like, dang, I got to wear those socks.
Yeah.
So that in itself is just a nice house cleaning, and it should be probably done every few years just to make sure, if you're not working with a professional, which we're kind of showing everybody what typically they have on a pretty consistent basis. So it sounds great. So we got to think about it. We do a mental accounting, we do a physical accounting of assets, liabilities, cash flow, different things. Where do we go from there? Like, well, so great, I got this all together. Now what?
I think you got to talk about it. And that's a step that people don't have too, is I don't know how many times Tim and I have heard, oh, well, I've thought about this, I've got this down, but then you don't share it. Before you even share it, you want to talk about it yourself to make sure it even sounds right?
Yeah.
The best teachers become better teachers by teaching. So talk about it, make sure it sounds feasible, doesn't just look good on paper, and then you got to share it with other people. So talk about it with your loved ones, and we'll come back to what that can look like. Make sure they understand that you've thought about this. Maybe they have input. Maybe you don't care what their input is, but it'd still be good to hear it. Maybe you do care a lot. Maybe it alters a perspective that you have. Maybe there's feelings involved in that. I witnessed that within my own family several times over. So talking about it with others within your friends and family group is really important. You don't have to share every detail, share as much as you want, but just let them know that this is a conversation piece, that maybe you're open for feedback. Also, let them know as you go through some of this actual putting this stuff together, where these things lie around. So for example, you should be talking with people about what roles you want them to play as you start entering the final stages of your life. Don't just assume that a person's going to take a role, or that they're the best fit for it, or that maybe at one point they were a great fit, but now they have a huge family of their own and they've moved and things have changed and now it's just not the same situation. But it's pretty commonplace where we'll see somebody, oh yeah, I'll list this person as my power of attorney or my executor of my estate. And I never even talked to the person about it. Don't do that. You don't have to share those details either, but just simply ask, do you understand this, what this means? And are you willing to do it? And check in with them every once in a while to make sure that situation hasn't changed. And then tell them where they could find the documents. Because a lot of times too, people will find the documents after the fact when someone's passed, and it's just not as useful. So give them a copy if indeed you're comfortable with that and they're comfortable with it, or at least tell them where it is. I mean, our clients, most of them actually send us a copy for us to keep on file. One, we say so that we know it's done and we can help facilitate, but two, we also could stop nagging them about not doing it. So, we know it's done then, but definitely share where you're comfortable, but share your thoughts at least with those family members, and talk with professionals about it too. There's a lot of nuances that may be dependent on your state laws. It may be dependent on your situation in the past. Could be based on a past marriage, and there might be some obligations there that you may not understand that affect other things. These are things that you should really kind of cover. So talking about it is a huge step. I think some people will think about it in silence, but they don't get to the talking about part.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, and having the conversation is always important, and making sure everybody's on the same page. Nathaniel in the office always talks about good communication. I think that's what Dan's trying to promote, is that everybody should be in communication about the specific subject, because at the end of the day, it does make things go a lot more smooth. And that communication is, and which we'll probably talk about a little bit further down the line, could even just be talking about why you're giving certain things to certain people. That in itself could be a gift that has no monetary value on it, but could be the most valuable thing that you ever give to somebody. And that's what we typically find, that at the event of passing, it's not about the money. It really is more about the emotion and the feelings of knowing that somebody cared, or that they gave you that specific ring that really has no value, but it is the most valuable piece of something that you'll ever receive in your life. So that communication is really important, because it's hard to communicate that when you no longer have the ability to do so. So I think communication is a big deal. So if we're going, okay, financial accounting, what do I have? Maybe I find my new cool socks. Then we go to, all right, let's talk about it with professionals. Let's talk about it maybe with family members. Let's start picking holes of like, why am I doing certain things? Does it make sense? Does it not? So let's say that we have a pretty good plan together. What do we do then? Where do we go with all that information? How do we execute on this type of stuff?
Yeah, great question, Tim. So this looks very custom for everybody, but there are some there are some avenues that people go down to explore this that are fairly standard. So we should talk about those components in some length here, I think. And I'll give a couple stories, I think, from my own past. I think is fair to do that, as to why you might want to think about things. And I'll try not to get too all over the place with it. Ying says I tapped too much in the last podcast. I'm staying as still as I can. So what do those look like? Okay, well, let's start from a higher level first. What do you need to consider? You need to consider family dynamics in this case, and there's documentation to help facilitate those different thoughts. You need to consider what costs can be. You need to consider what your intent is with these documents, because even that gets dictated differently when it comes to putting pen to paper. You need to think about those different assets, because those different assets are treated differently within documentation as well. So there's a lot of overlining pieces to build in. And let's just give some examples as to what would you do with that after that. This could mean trust planning. Very scary word because people don't understand that. They think of trust fund babies right off the bat, and that can be a result of some trust fund planning. Probably not a desired result most of the time, but also is not the majority of the case.
I think most people think of like trust planning in the movies where everyone's in this like great ballroom and they're all sitting and one family's on one side, another family's on the other side, and the lawyer's in the middle reading out the will, being like, okay, Dan Weiss, you're receiving. No, that's not trust planning in the slightest.
That's not.
That's just the movies.
It's the movies.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's usually a bit more quieter than that experience. But what do you want to use a trust? There's different kinds of trust. What does it facilitate? Is it building, which we'll come back to, a legacy that you're trying to leave? And what does that mean to you? It means different things for different people. Is it facilitating in hopes to avoid different problems? Are you trying to keep it so that you can make things sustainable for people for a period of time? You trying to get an objective accomplished? Are you simply just trying to avoid keeping your financial business becoming public? Is it something that makes sense from a cost standpoint, because you're looking at having this process of probate, meaning you go through the court systems because you're having property in multiple states, and that becomes complicated and opens up several court probates because it's in several different counties? Does a trust make sense to mitigate that and keep it smoother? Is it just about that? Is it about having your loved ones that you leave behind a greater ease when it comes to dealing with this stuff, so they could actually focus on what's most important, which is the emotional aspects of them losing you? A trust is one way to do that, but this is estate planning in general. Does it make sense just to have a will? Maybe. What else do you have to think about? Do you think about things like a tangible list of inventory, which is also sometimes called a separate writing agreement or so? Tim's already referred to this. So here's story number one. I'll stay still if I can. So story number one is he's right. It's not usually the money that most people we find have problems with, because the money is most likely going to be discussed if anything is discussed and dictated very well. The problem comes down to the sentimental things that remind you of that person. It's what you think you deserve or that person doesn't deserve. And that's where the fights kind of come into play, because they get forgotten about. In my family, to give you an example, is my great grandmother had this necklace that she used to wear for most of her adult life that I'm familiar with. And when she passed away 20 years ago, about 20 years ago, that necklace, she had two daughters, was contested. I don't think there was any monetary value to that necklace, not enough to dissolve relationships about, usually isn't enough. But for years, they had to pass this necklace halfway across the country back and forth and fight about it and withhold it from each other until one finally passed away. And that's just not probably what my great grandmother would have wanted. It just defeats the purpose. But we see that all the time when it comes to things that you just don't think about listing, because there's greater value in those kind of items. So list it out, have some control, be deliberate about those actions, give those people things that you think are meaningful for them, and make sure that you get that taken care of. This is about you taking care of your loved ones the way that you want them to be taken care of. Another thought too that often gets missed out when you should be thinking about what you want to do in this situation is not asset related, but it is burial related. And this document typically comes after someone's created their estate planning, and therefore it gets forgotten about. Don't do that. it's really a critical time. Maybe not for you. A lot of times we get from people, I don't care. Just take me out and back and finish me. Okay, yeah, that doesn't really happen. That doesn't really work like that. Or it's, I don't care how I'm buried. Let that be up to them. You got to think about the state that you're leaving people. Is that really up to them? Do they really know? We've seen this going around a number of times. It's just not what someone thinks. Now, I'll give you my second story, which is also a personal one too. My father passed away when he was 61 years old. It's been, man, it has been about almost 10 years now. And when he passed away, he had some instructions to have a Jewish ceremony in Chicago at a specific cemetery. Tim knows the story. I've shared this with a number of people throughout the years. He had remarried, and a very short marriage while he had a stint at a nursing home when he was ill. And as a result of this, those plans got changed. Now, there are a few states in this country like Wisconsin, California, Texas, that are marital property states, and the spouse has a lot of power over those situations in those states. So instead of getting a Jewish ceremony, which typically means closed casket, of more of a private nature in Chicago, what he received was an open casket ceremony inside of a barn in Wisconsin, open to the public. Very different than what he wanted. Now, as his son, I'm indifferent. I was indifferent about what that experience was, as long as it was his experience. It's not what he wrote down 7 months before that date. So I had no power, but at least he wrote something down that I could share with the cemetery to let the cemetery know that if they proceeded with such manners, that would be shared among the Jewish community in a 50-mile radius. And guess what? My father got buried in Chicago. So instead of cremated from post barn. So these are very important documents because it's about someone seeing through your wishes, but there is pain, and there's a lot of possible worse pain, unnecessary pain that can come from this too. You know, in my dad's case, his parents were still alive. So they didn't go to that barn, right? It's one of the most awful things I could think about as a parent having to bury a child, let alone having to bury a child in customs that you know he didn't want, right? So again, think about who you leave behind. Those matters are a lot more serious than you think. You want something read there, you want something not read there, you want someone there, you want someone not there. This is your last kind of transition out of this world. It should be given the care that it deserves. You also got to think about like medical directives, healthcare directives, that is. A lot of times people pass on that too. That puts you in a situation where it's very uncomfortable for other people. You may not be with it. It may not matter for you, but it's not typical that you are ill and then you're gone. Typically, even if it's a week, like there's a transition process there too. You make sure that it's the way that you want, and considering what it does to people around you as well. So think about pieces like that. Just to name a few, I guess the other one that I'll throw out there too is think about your beneficiaries. We see a lot of issues with this from a titling standpoint, where you have accounts that are mistitled, and then it creates problems. Tim and I, in the last couple of months, have dealt with someone, for example, who received an insurance policy, and that insurance policy was purchased by another company. Now, we believe in that purchase that they did not carry over the beneficiary designation form, leaving it to his wife. Because they did not do that, it's left to his estate, which now means that they have to open up a probate estate, go through all this process, tie up this money, pay costs to the courts, as opposed to simply just receiving that money to help them pay for the burial. So you got to think about how things are titled, different assets, again, titled in different ways. Speak with a professional about that, we would recommend. So those are just kind of some of the things from a structure standpoint that a person needs to consider.
I mean, which is great. I mean, that was a lot. And I think everybody probably appreciates those stories too. I mean, it's always nice to hear real life stories about why we should be doing this, because as Dan mentioned in his stat before, not a lot of people are doing this, and they really should be doing it and should be talking to professionals. This is really a step in the process is where you go talk to a lawyer and potentially have things drafted like a trust, a will, and having these conversations. But I think it's nice because if you can go and educate it into those meetings, it can be a lot smoother because there's a lot of lingo. Both in the law world as well as our world, there's a lot of information and nuance that most of the general public just don't know. But if you can educate yourself at least as much to understand what they're saying, like what is a trust? What's an irrevocable trust? What is a revocable trust? What is a will? What is a pour over will? What is a healthcare directive? Is that pull the plug document? You can then be more in tune with the meeting, and that which can make it a lot more smooth and easier for you to understand.
That's right. We didn't mention, like, do you pre-plan your funeral? What does that look like?
Yep.
Is that a
Do you
cost
buy
we
a
should
barrel of
consider?
plots? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think the last point that I know that we want to probably hit home, kind of going off of all this subject, is, why is this so important? Why do we state the stat? I think it was 62%, I believe what you said.
67.
67% of people don't do this, and we think more people should. Why is it so important? I'm going to ask you that question, but I'm going to preface it a little bit that I think a lot of people sometimes have this idea that I don't have enough assets. Again, going back to the movies, Dan Weiss receives X, Y, and Z. It's not what happens. And people then have this idea as well that you have to have a lot of money to do this type of planning. We would argue that that is not the case. You should be doing this regardless of how many assets you have. Now, if you have assets that are quite large, it's a different type of nuance and it's a different type of an approach versus maybe somebody who doesn't have as many assets in their name. But it doesn't mean that we should not be doing this type of planning. And it doesn't mean that you would be evolving into some different type of planning, depending on the growth of your assets or the growth of your wealth over time. And when I say wealth, I really mean assets and liabilities over time. But, Dan, why is it so important that regardless of the spectrum, people should be having these conversations and executing on something to at least a certain degree? Obviously, everything's a spectrum, but why should they be doing it?
I think what I hear you asking, Tim, is a question about legacy, which we mentioned earlier too. You don't have to have money to have a legacy. We all have the rights to an opportunity to leave a legacy. And that means different things for different people. Sometimes legacy means that you are helping as many people as possible. Or maybe legacy means that you want to be remembered by as many people as possible. Maybe legacy means that you don't care if you're remembered by a lot of people, but there's a specific person that you really made an impact for and you want to be remembered for them. Your impact was great enough that is a legacy, right? Maybe it is about the good deeds that you've done. Maybe it is about the money that you left for others to do good deeds. There's not a definition as to what that looks like. And although money can help drive a lot of that legacy, it's not the needed ingredient to do it. It's thought about what you want that legacy to be and how you want that to look and how you want to play it out and spell it out. If you don't address it, it's going to be a very difficult thing to actually accomplish because no one's going to know what you want it to do and how you want it to do it. And that is not just a shame for you to experience, but it's a shame that they have to experience that too. So having the thought to think about what your legacy is and then putting it to form to make sure that it's executed, that leaves a lasting impression depending on how you want that impression to be, right? No action is still action. So what does that mean from a funding standpoint if we look back at the technical aspects of this? These instruments, when do you fund them to make sure that legacy happens? How? Who? When do you do that in their lives? Do you want to see your heirs enjoy some of these funds and assets now while you're alive? Do you not? Is it about gifting? There are different ways to gift. How do you want to handle that? Is it about is it about moral standards? Is it about setting expectations for people? Is it about support? A lot of this comes right back to the communication, whether it's in a business form, this should be talked about. There should be documents such as operating agreements that dictate how this happens. If I, being the oldest of partners here, were to pass away, I don't want that to be a hindrance to the enterprise that we're growing past our own lifetimes. I don't want that to be a hindrance to our clients we care about. I don't want to be a hindrance to him, right? I also want to make sure that my family is taken care of. None of that happens if we don't talk about what that legacy looks like and the mechanisms to actually make that work. Inside the household, we talk about this a lot too. I wouldn't say that you should treat I kind of feel like you should treat your business like family. If you are lucky enough to be able to do that, it's hard for me to say you should treat your family like business unless you're good at running a business, because in all reality, there are aspects there. So should you be having family meetings? Maybe, regardless of wealth, as to what you want done. Most of the time, people are like, I don't know what my parents want. I don't know if they've done anything. It's a chaotic situation that they get thrown into at some point. Is that the legacy that you want? Probably not. So that, I think, is what you're talking about. Another one that gets missed all the time too is digital assets in this day and age. So where are your passwords? Very careful about this. Not saying give people your passwords. So Nathaniel, hear me loud and clear on that.
1Password is a great tool.
It is a great tool. And yeah, Tim is right. There are tools to store those passwords. It's very important, because what are you storing digitally? My guess is that could be pictures, memories, right? That could be
the most valuable assets that you have.
That's right. There's part of, like, today, there's very difficult to have a life that doesn't have some sort of digital remembrance of important events. So how do you want to caretake for that? How do you want to caretake for people when you're gone? What does life look like after life?
And to emphasize the digital assets as well is two-step authentication. If it's going through an email, if you don't have access to that email at the person's death, it may be very difficult to even log into bank accounts. And I mean, there's now where there's digital bank accounts where there's no branches. So who are you calling? And they are very strict on who they will give that up to and how you can actually access it. Digital assets are becoming a very real thing and need to be a conversation, especially as the generations continue to evolve and technology becomes more and more a part of everybody's life. And I think it's even for older generations at this point, it's very much a part of it. But as the generations are younger, it's going to be even more important on that end of it. Mm-hmm. And I do think, and Dan points out a lot of good points on why this is so important. And I go back to that, regardless of assets or regardless of liabilities, or regardless of your wealth, this should be a conversation at least. From there, you can start spectruming up into trusts, wills, different things that you may need to put together. But having a conversation around your passing is extremely important, as it can really benefit the people you leave behind. I can't explain to people how many times in our job that we watch and help people going through an estate, or helping closing an estate, or watching people pass, how difficult it can be when things aren't set up appropriately. It puts a lot of stress and angst onto the rest of the family or people who are involved to try to make sure it's done and done appropriately, because they're coming in. As Dan was talking at one point, I was thinking about, people come in to these situations where they're expected to, work heavy machinery, and they're like, I've worked a desk job my whole life. I have no idea how to get into that machine and dig a hole. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know what I'm doing. That happens a lot. And so having those conversations, at least knowing that you need to prepare, maybe you can start reading the manual. I mean, like, oh, how do I work this machine? But overall, it's not something to take lightly. And that's why the conversation at most should be had, even if you don't do anything else. Even though Dan and I would recommend very highly that people continue to do like more than just that. But you should at least have the communication with whoever is close to you in your circle and unit. Dan, would you like me to start with final thoughts, or would you like to start? I'm happy to start wherever you like.
Oh, please do, Tim.
I'll let Dan end, because Dan was our guest. I think he did a fantastic job explaining. We have these conversations quite often. Dan does a lot of that work within it. And I think my final thoughts with everything on this specific subject is that I think it's a spectrum. And again, I'll go back to making sure that you communicate at least at the base level. That is extremely important. And I think that throughout my years of doing this job, the things that kill me the most is when that somebody gave somebody something, or they did something for a reason, they never wrote it down, and they never explained it to the person on why they did it. That to me is just a financial tragedy that can be avoided by just explaining, like, hey, Dan, I actually gave you this specific ring because I noticed how much you were with grandpa, with grandma, you came out to visit. I knew this was important to you. That in itself could pay dividends for years to come. Mm-hmm. And it could change someone's life. But just giving Dan the ring and having Dan come up with the story on why he received that ring could cause a lot of drama, could cause a lot of unknowns. And that uncertainty is something that can be avoided. by just communicating it. And it is, that in itself is the smallest thing, but it is also the biggest thing. And it goes all the way down from how you set up your estate, how you set up your trust. And then the last thing I'd say is, as you upscale into different assets, it becomes a bigger problem, and it becomes a bigger conversation, both from a tax efficiency perspective, but also, for example, someone could have a family estate, right? And let's say you sell a business and those kids don't have the resources to support the estate, but there still has to be property tax. How does that handled, right? You start getting into larger amounts of wealth, becomes more and more of a problem. As Biggie said, more money, more problems. That is very real. That is why you have different mechanisms to be able to help support, protect, and do different things. So it's really a range from all the way up to the top of wealth, all the way back down to the bottom. And how you handle those situations are going to be nuanced and different. But the core to it all is communicating it, having family meetings, discussing it with others. It's important. And I do think in the United States, we have this weird taboo when it comes to talking about finances and about our financial situations. But I think it is one of the more important things to do. You don't have to talk about numbers. You can just talk about strategy. You can talk about what happens, but you don't need to tell people, hey, I'm going to give you X amount of money. That doesn't need to be part of the conversation. And I think sometimes people think you have to, and you don't. And that could also deter people from even starting the conversation, as we started at the very beginning. So that is my final thoughts for this topic.
Great points. I'll drop the quote that I think Tim was thinking I'm going to drop here, which is by Benjamin Franklin, which is, nothing is certain except death and taxes. I think Tim and I would probably add uncertainty is certain, and so is change. But who are we to get into Franklin's business? But nonetheless, we don't think he's wrong about what he said there. It happens to all of us, whether or not we want to think about it, address it. It's going to happen. So because we know that, we might as well position ourselves in the best way possible. L'dor vidor, from generation to generation. You want to talk about how wealth is really built? We primarily work with people that are first generation wealth, right? How do you keep that going? You pass it on generation to generation. This is a big part of how you do that. That is how you strengthen your family over time, is good planning, good positioning, good thought, good discussion on matters like this. You have to change the narrative around death. So without that being said, I guess the last thing I'll add is, I hope I did a better job of tapping, but I also did notice towards the end of this that I left my water bottle on the table for this whole thing. So I'll get in trouble for that later. I'm sorry. But we thank all of you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure, and appreciate your attention and you tuning in and being part of us and this. Until next time, have a great night.
Thank you for taking the time to start your journey of thinking differently and listening to LBW talk about stuff they love. Until next time.